So, this is the third lecture on Socio Hydrology, the emerging theoretical framework by the natural scientists. So, who are mainly hydrologists, but now they have incorporated society, or they are trying to incorporate the societal variables within the hydrological framework, leading to the evolution and emergence of what is known as socio hydrology. So, I would be talking about like what is socio hydrology, and I would be trying to talk about like what are the methods and methodologies that the socio hydrologists believe in and they imply, deploy and implement, and also talking about one or two cases or a little bit of empirical findings from their research. But one has to keep in mind that it is an emerging framework. So, it is a very recent framework. So, some of the ongoing researches are taking place in this field. It has not been clouded with much research up till now, but there are some significant contributions in this field already, which we would be covering and touching upon. I would request you also to go through one particular reading material that I am going to provide on this, a particular paper by Anna Wieselink and her colleagues, which came out in Wares Water again very recently in 2017. So, I will start with a particular case, a case study of a particular Australian river. It is called the Murrumbidgee river. So, I will start with this Murrumbidgee river basin story. So, let us not think about anything else, let us not think about any technicalities or any other what to say scientific or technical components regarding a river or a river basin. Just let us concentrate on the story. So, I will just narrate a story which you need to listen to very carefully, and then I will link it up with socio hydrology. That would be a different thing, but let us now forget about socio hydrology, hydrosocial, whatever. Let us just concentrate on this simple story. So, in 2010, the Australian, the magazine, it reported that irrigators in this particular river basin, they were up in arms against the government. Now, why were they up in arms against the government in the month of November 2010? So, they were up in arms against the government because the government took a concerted plan and a concerted action that these farmers, they have to sell their water rights, they have to sell their water allocation rights to the government, because the government was in a mood to revive and restore the health of the river. So, it was a direct clash between the interests and requirements of the the irrigators, the farmers, and the riparian environment. So, environment which was still in the back seat suddenly became very prominent. So, it directly clashed with the interests of the irrigators and the farmers, who were extremely unhappy with the whole situation that they have now to sell their water rights in this particular region. So, what would happen to their livelihoods? What would happen to their occupation? These were some of the concerns that that were worrying these distressed farmers and the irrigators. Now, if we really need to analyze the story, we have to understand the particular narrative from a long term temporal scale. So, I will take you back to history. So, I will take you back to 100 years, maybe the early 90th and the early 20th century. In 1900, what was happening in this particular river basin? So, if we just focus on the 1900 by following a backcasting methodology, so we will find out that during the 1900s, there were no dams, no weirs, no infrastructure, no construction on these particular river basin. So, it was the river was flowing at its own will, and there was no infrastructural intervention on this particular river. But gradually what happened is that due to both subsistence and surplus requirement, that is due to in order to provide food to the farmers. So, due to this particular in order to accomplish the particular purpose of producing increasing agricultural fertility and food production, and also with the very objective of producing surplus, providing agricultural exports. Gradually what happened is that these area or the river corridor, it saw certain infrastructural interventions, first initially in 1920s in the form of what is known as irrigation channels or irrigation canals, when this entire area was irrigated. Then in 1940s what happened is that water was abstracted during low flows, 50% of the natural flow, and in the 1950s it went up to 100%. So, this is how this entire river basin was actually changing. And again, if we trace this particular period, this 4-5 decades between 1950s and 1980s, 90s, we will find out that there were agricultural development, there were farming development, there were irrigation facilities, there were the construction of what is known as quote unquote water assets, that is the construction of dams, weirs, etc., and also whole lot of water abstraction and extraction which was taking place in the upstream of this particular river basin. So, water was abstracted, water was extracted, and people were quite happy with their occupation, and both the subsistence and surplus needs of the economy were being met. Now, what happened is that since the 1980s, the political agenda started changing. So, the environment started to become a very important issue. So, the government thought that it is not only the economic rights of the farmers or the economic agenda that is the most important, but the environmental agenda, the agenda of restoring the health of the river, and also the agenda of reviving lost biodiversity were very important objectives which needed to be met, needed to be accomplished. So, finally what happened is that in 2007, in the face of a large looming federal election on one hand, and on other hand there was this protracted drought which was going on. Finally, the government came up with a concerted plan of action that now it is time for the irrigators, now it is time for the farmers to sell their rights, their water rights, and for the sake of the environment. So, it was a direct clash, as I mentioned, between the communities, between the farming communities and the riparian environment, which finally led to a massive clash between the government and these particular communities. So, now if we look into the hydrological changes in this particular river basin, and if we can foresee a landscape comprising of both human settlements and human induced infrastructures will become different from what it is now. So, now the question is like how can we explain this transformation, how can we explain the hydrological change in the Murrumbidgee river basin. So, how can we really explain the transformation, ecological transformation and also societal transformation. So, the hydrological changes are these outcomes of the societal decision making patterns or the political decision making that had taken place since the last few decades in this entire river basin. On the other hand, like how hydrological changes has affected the societal decision making. So, the question is how hydrology has affected societal decision making, and on the other hand how social processes or social systems had determined hydrological changes or the hydrological processes in that particular Australian river basin. So, how can we answer these questions? So, here comes the role of socio hydrology. So, if we really want to explain the transformation or the changes in that particular Australian river basin, neither can we ignore the variables, the physical variables that are very important that had played an important role in the hydrological cycle or the hydrological processes. On the other hand, neither can we ignore the very important role of the social variables that had also played major role in transforming or in affecting the hydrological processes in that river basin. So, is prediction of water cycle dynamics over long time scales feasible without including the interactions and feedbacks with human systems? This is the most important thing which I need to highlight. Interactions and feedbacks with human systems. Interactions and feedback. So, interactions between what? Interactions between water cycle, interactions between nature or water and human system. So, what is socio hydrology? So, socio hydrology is a particular science. It is a science of people and water. It is a science of people and water aimed at understanding the dynamics or the processes and the fundamental statement co-evolution of coupled human water systems. What is meant by coupled human water systems? What is meant by co-evolution? Co-evolution means how there is the evolution of two processes, but going parallel hand in hand. So, that is called co-evolution, like co-production, right. And coupled human water system, it means where human and water are embedded. So, the way humans would behave, the way human activities would affect the water cycle, and in turn the way the water cycle would affect human beings or human activities. So, this is what is known as the coupled. Coupled means which is already embedded. So, which are not separate, which are joined, which are this is the meaning or this is the significance of coupled. So, what is socio hydrology? It is the process and dynamics of through which the co-evolution of coupled human water systems can be understood. And this diagram also to a great extent explains the relationship between the water systems and the human systems. So, how socio hydrological dynamics is located in between hydrology and sociology. So, how hydrology and sociology to a great extent they exchange between one another, and how socio hydrological processes or dynamics are taken into account. Yeah. So, this is the socio hydrological system that explains the human water interaction, the human water coupling more importantly, and this is very important to know that socio hydrology, it is the research theme for the current decade. And what is this current decade? This is the duration 2013 to 2022. So, we are already in this current decade, and one of the vital research themes for water research today is socio hydrology, and it aims to advance the science of hydrology for the benefit of society. So, no more it is interested to reflect on only the biophysical processes that water comprises of, but it also is interested about the societal decision making or the social systems or the social processes, variables and dynamics for the benefit of the society. So, the benefit of the society, again the benefit of the society, that is the key word. The key phrase. So, how water interacts across both biophysical and societal processes, because in the previous lecture I talked about hydrology, in the previous lecture I talked about hydrological cycle. So, if you remember that hydrological cycle said that it is all about the functioning of the water cycle or the water engine, whether human activity or whether human beings are present there or not. But socio hydrology is not that particular case, because socio hydrology it very much takes into consideration that human beings they play vital role, the human beings are vital components within transformation in hydrological processes and vice versa. So, little more on socio hydrology and more importantly socio hydrologic processes. So, what are socio-hydrologic dynamics or socio-hydrologic processes? Now, if we raise this simple question or if we try to answer this simple question, which way water is flowing? Let us just imagine which way water flows. Of course, it flows downstream, down, right. So, like if we try to explain it following technical understanding by following the technical perception, then definitely we know that in subsurface hydrology the key driver of flow and transport are always the potential gradients. Streams flow in response to topographic gradients and evaporation occurs due to humidity gradients. So, the idea is that it is quite clear that water flows downhill. So, this is the technical and physical explanation that where in which way water flows downhill. Now, the question is, can water flow uphill? Can water flow uphill? The answer is of course yes, it can. Now, how can it flow uphill? If it is pumped uphill. So, the key word is pumping. So, we can change the direction of water. There can be diversion through the use of technical devices, through the use of hydraulic technique, in this case specifically the pump. So, water can be pumped uphill. Now, so this pumping, this is not only a physical process, it is a human activity. So, it includes a societal process. So, physically water flows downhill, but then when this social component gets added, water can be pumped uphill. So, the flow of water can be manipulated, the flow of water can be to a great extent controlled by human activity. So, here societal component becomes a very powerful element to to manipulate the flow of water. So, people are endogenous part of the water cycle. So, socio hydrology gives us the understanding that one cannot remove people from the socio hydrologic processes. So, people form an endogenous part of the water cycle and people of course interact with the system in multiple ways. So, can we can we ignore the role of markets, the role of policies, the role of technologies? So, what is an infrastructure? An infrastructure is a combination of techniques, physical components and definitely the social needs. So, every technological infrastructural intervention has a macro larger societal story and also the political and historical context and economic context of technological intervention have to be taken into consideration. So, we need to really see the macro picture, the larger picture where we really need to see the role of human beings, we really need to see the political, social, economic and also cultural context that play major role determining the technical choices that are made during particular points of time. So, this brings us to the next part of our next part of the lecture, next important component, that how there has been a move from IWRM to social hydrology or socio hydrology. So, what is IWRM? It is integrated water resource management and this came up this is it is also known as the Dublin, it came up during the Dublin it is called the Dublin Principles of 1992. So, there was this international conference on environment and water and so IWRM was described or defined as a process that leads to or that will lead to coordinated development and management of not only water, but water, land and related resources. So, for the first time it was understood that if you really need to, if you are interested about water, if you want to protect water, if you want to come up with really fruitful and meaningful water management practices, then you have to also consider land and you have to also consider the other related resources which are extremely or intricately interrelated with water resources. And what was the aim? Why IWRM wanted to come up with a coordinated development and management of water, land and related resources? Because the purpose was to maximize economic and social welfare. So, IWRM actually rests on three major principles that form the overall framework of IWRM. Now, what are these three major principles? One is social equity, that is water should be allocated to all. So, different users, different stakeholders, more importantly the poor and vulnerable and marginalized sections of the society. Some frameworks or some solutions should be chalked out through which all the users will have to an extent an equal allocation and access to water resources. So, that is one of the fundamental principles within IWRM, which is the principle of social equity. So, this is one. The second is economic efficiency. So, what is economic efficiency? It says that the greatest use of water resource for the benefit of the greatest number of people. So, that is the principle of economic efficiency, and there is another very important principle or component which is called ecological sustainability. So, what is ecological sustainability? It says that not only the human world or not only the human beings, but there are also other very key important species whose ecological functions are very important in water resources. So, those species in water resources, their so that their ecological functions are retained and restored, that should also be taken care of. So, there should be adequate planning through which vital ecosystems within water should be taken care of. So, these are the three principles: social equity, economic efficiency and ecological sustainability, on which IWRM rests on. But one of the little bit of criticism, not criticism, but I mean it is limited in the sense that it is still a planning and a management tool that strives towards social welfare, that strives towards ecological welfare. Now, how socio hydrology is different from IWRM? Socio hydrology is different from IWRM in the sense it is a very well developed comprehensive science which tries to or which attempts to observe, understand and predict future trajectories. This is the most important thing, future trajectories of co-evolution of coupled human water systems. So, it not only observes and understands the present trajectories or the present realities, but it also tries to predict the future trajectories. So, by knowing what is happening today, and not only by knowing the present, but it also will see that when we will go to the cases, we will see that how socio hydrological research also builds upon the past. So, what the scientists do, they try to generate data using long term temporal scales. So, what happened during the past, they will collect data on that. So, they will develop a data set on that. What is going on in the present, they will observe that, they will understand the past events, they will observe the present events, and they will predict that on the basis of past and present, what kind of future trajectories will take shape, will take place. So, this is the fundamental objective of socio hydrology, that it also predicts future trajectories by understanding and observing and looking into past events and also the present realities. So, like Sivapalan, again one of the socio hydrologists, he mentions that it is the fundamental science. So, it is the fundamental science underpinning the practice of IWRM. So, while IWRM is basically a practical tenet, socio hydrology provides the theoretical framework towards a theoretical framework for underpinning the practice or practice of integrated water resource management. So, this is again one of the most important sections in socio hydrology, like what are the methods and methodologies followed by the scientists, by the socio hydrologists. So, one has to keep in mind that though socio hydrology, the term itself indicates that the society is very much incorporated within hydrology, but at the same time one has to keep in mind that it is absolutely, it is totally quantitative science. There is no qualitative element in socio hydrology. So, when we will look into the limitations, we will see that how this is one of the challenges within socio hydrology as well, that it absolutely depends on the quantitative techniques and the quantitative tools, but this is the truth that it is nothing but it is nothing but quantitative science. So, for example, like when a socio hydrologist would try to when a socio hydrologist would try to evaluate flood investment strategy, how would he do that? So, how would his methodology be different and divergent from a hydrologist? Because if a hydrologist wants to predict and evaluate flood investment strategy, he would only be depending on the hardcore stochastic flood model. But in socio hydrologists would basically combine these three things, that is the stochastic flood model, the cost benefit analysis and agent based modeling of societal decision making. So, not only they will depend on the stochastic flood model, which is extremely technical, but they will also depend on, they will also do a rigorous cost benefit analysis, and they will also take into account the perceptions, the behaviors, the other variables that play important role in societal decision making. So, in socio hydrology, the technical and the societal elements and variables would combine, through which and through this combination and integration this evaluation and the prediction would take place. So, we had discussed the methodology. Now, let us discuss some of the case studies. I will just quickly touch upon some of the case studies, some of the very recent case studies that had been published using the socio hydrological approach. So, like this Murrumbidgee river basin case, which we had already discussed, because we started this entire this lecture with that particular case narrative, with that particular story. So, Van Emmerik et al. 2014 they covered this Murrumbidgee river story. So, that is itself a case through which Van Emmerik and his colleagues tried to explain changes in hydrological processes by also taking into consideration societal systems. Similarly, El Shafai et al. 2014, they had looked into human hydrology interactions at the broader catchment system scale by looking into 5-6 important parameters, including catchment hydrology, population, economics, environment, socio-economic sensitivity and collective response. So, you can see, so for example, catchment hydrology, it is a hardcore technical component, but on the other hand, like demography, economics, environment, socio-economic sensitivity, collective response, these things are also there. So, it combines the technical processes and technical components along with societal components. So, that is very much evident in El Shafai case study. Then a very interesting case study has been done by D. Baldassar and Vigilion. I really do not know how to pronounce, but then roughly this D. Baldassar and Vigilion. So, in some of the studies they had published few papers in these lines, and they had done a very interesting analysis, or they had done actually series of analysis on floodplain hydrology, and they have come up with certain patterns which they call the adaptation effect and the levee effect. I will little explain this both briefly, what is this adaptation effect and levee effect. So, what they have done is that they had conducted their research in the Po floodplain, and then they say like that like sometimes the communities they actually pursue this, sometimes in the communities this adaptation effect becomes strong, and this adaptation effect is what, like when there is the lack of the implementation of hardcore flood defense management strategies, or flood defense infrastructure is not employed, then what happens is that there are frequent floods, but then the severity of floods are not much. So, the severity of floods is less, but on the other hand floods are frequent. But then the vulnerability is also less, because the severity of floods is also less. On the other hand, the levee effect, it means that when are levees constructed? So, when levees are constructed, then what happens is that of course, the frequency of floods gets reduced, but at the same time when there are floods, the intensity and severity of these floods are much more. So, which leads to an increased vulnerability among the communities. So, by developing a very interesting conceptual mathematical model, Baldassar and Viglione, they actually tried to predict that when the communities would actually pursue, I mean when there would be the adaptation effect or when there would be the levee effect. So, they did lot of, they use very interesting sophisticated quantitative techniques through which, and they also use simulation, and they also included fictive time series and all that to designate that which pattern will be important at what particular points of time. So, three avenues in socio hydrology. Sivapalan in one of his papers, he talks about that there are three major avenues in socio hydrology which can actually make socio hydrology extremely comprehensive. So, what are these three avenues? So, one is historical socio hydrology, the second one is comparative socio hydrology, and the third one is process socio hydrology. So, first let us focus on historical socio hydrology. So, what is historical socio hydrology? So, here the socio hydrologists actually they try to depend on the data related to events of the past, because they argue and they understand that even ancient civilizations grew, they evolved and also declined and collapsed due to changes in the coupled human water interactions. For example, if we take the example of ancient Sumer, then we very much know that one of the reasons behind the decline or collapse of the Sumerian civilization was that there were rising water tables, and there was also salinization due to extensive irrigation. So, they say that these historical elements should be taken into consideration, and they also, for example, they also talk about how across different historical periods of time, different water governance strategies had evolved and different water technologies had also evolved. For example, in Iran there had been the development of qanat. These are very interesting water structures where actually water can be tapped from the ground, but there is no need for pumping. And Iran, I mean these qanats, these had survived the test of time. So, socio hydrologists talk about the incorporation of the historical data, the incorporation of historical frameworks in their research, so that they can have a long term understanding, long term trajectory of how things went on. So, then they can really come up with very comprehensive data sets. So, this is one. The second one is comprehensive socio hydrology. So, what is comprehensive socio hydrology? So, it means that for example, the data that had been generated for a particular catchment, then again data set generated for another particular catchment, these two data sets or multiple data sets across multiple catchments can be compared. And what is the purpose? What is the use of this comparative socio hydrology? Because if these data sets across multiple catchments, for example, can be compared, then the socio hydrologists would be able to map the spatial variations and the regional differences, which are also very important for this particular field of socio hydrology. And the final one is process socio hydrology. It is nothing more, but process socio hydrology means that process socio hydrology, it means that there should be rigorous understanding of the process through routine monitoring, and so all the micro data sets along with the macro picture should be very much there, so that the processes can be taken note of, can be accounted rigorously and in enormous details. So, finally, so we had discussed in detail about what social hydrology is all about, why is it important, and how it absolutely depends on the quantitative methodology. Now, the final thing is that the major shortcoming or the major challenge in socio hydrology is that if we raise this particular question, can quantitative modeling address plurality of human values, differing human agency, societal power relations? How can all these important parameters like perceptions, like adaptation, like resilience can fit within a quantitative model? How can that fit within a typically developed or conceptualized quantitative model? Because perceptions of communities, adaptation skills of communities, and finally resilience of communities will differ across communities in different areas, in different localities, across different temporal scales. So, you can never actually come up with universal predictions by doing some research on a particular community at a particular location during a particular historical time. So, these things, perceptions, adaptation, resilience, similarly human values, human agency, power relations, these can never fit into quantitative modeling. So, socio hydrology actually it suffers from what Troy says, Troy et al. Says in one of the papers published in 2015 that so it suffers from oppositional challenges. So, on one hand the desire to be quantitative versus the need to incorporate qualitative knowledge from social science. On one hand the need to base analysis on empirical facts, on the other hand to attempt the attempt to develop generalizable understanding. So, these are the oppositional challenges that socio hydrology is encountering today, and these so this brings us to the question that how to reconcile numerical data with descriptive histories. So, if we have descriptive histories, can descriptive history totally fit within a quantitative model? Can this numerical data, can data on descriptive histories, I mean how it can be reconciled, how socio hydrology can reconcile numerical data sets within or with descriptive histories. So, yes, so these are the references, and to end, I mean I would just say that this is the challenge within socio hydrology that actually now would enable us to look into, are there alternative frameworks that has rigorous qualitative models or that has developed rigorous qualitative analysis and qualitative frameworks to and that had developed some conceptual tools through which different needs and different perceptions, different capabilities of different social stakeholders across spatial and temporal scales can be taken into consideration. So, socio hydrology also, it seems not to be a very comprehensive or a complete scientific framework, though it is still very, I mean it's close to compositeness, but at the same time there are some limitations in it which were discussed. So, but then it would provoke us, then it would enable us to think that whether there are other alternative frameworks through which through qualitative insights, through qualitative frameworks, things can be understood and analysis, and that would lead us to the next lecture, which would be on hydrosocial, that how hydrosocial help us to go beyond this quantitative modeling within that is practiced by socio hydrologists to capture deeper details and to capture larger realities. Thank you.